Hi, I'm Stephen Yale-Loehr, and I'm the proud moderator of this discussion about immigration, what's happened in 2025 and what might happen in 2026. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a retired immigration law professor at Cornell Law School, where I taught immigration and asylum law for 30 years. I also practiced immigration law with a firm here in Ithaca, New York, and was co-author of a leading immigration treatise. I also co-founded the Migration and Human Rights program at Cornell Law School. Speaking of the program, that really sets at the nexus of practice and research on immigration law. It supports the collaboration of scholars at the law school and elsewhere on important immigration policy and research issues. And you'll see some of the people who participate in the program here as panelists. Let me introduce them in alphabetical order. Dan Berger is a graduate of Cornell Law School and is a partner at Green and Spiegel. He leads the firm's academic and medical immigration team. He's also a non-resident academic fellow at Cornell Law School. And he also co-founded the Path to Papers project at Cornell Law School, which helps recipients of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. Next, we have Michelle Brunet, who's currently the executive director at Together and Free, which is a nonprofit that provides support services to migrant families. She's also a non-resident fellow at our Migration and Human Rights program. She previously served as the Immigration Detention Ombudsman and led the Family Reunification Task Force at the Department of Homeland Security. We also have Teresa Cardinal Brown, who's a non-resident fellow at Cornell Law School's Migration and Human Rights program. Her career spans 3 decades of bipartisan federal immigration law and policy. She's worked for the government and the private sector trying to get people to talk about immigration in a positive way. And she had several senior advisory positions with the Department of Homeland Security in both the Bush and Obama administrations. We also have Bita Mostofi, who is an immigration policy fellow at Hyphen, and you guessed it, a non-resident fellow at the Cornell Migration and Human Rights program. She previously was a senior advisor at the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services and served as the commissioner of the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs in New York City. We've got a lot to cover today. Let's sort of just let me go start by saying how much has happened in the last year. There have been over 500 policy changes on immigration in the last year, covering everything from birthright citizenship to travel bans to a pause on the diversity lottery program to pauses on adjudications to more detentions and arrests than ever, self-deportations, third-party removals, refugee admission determinations. And it's been a real headache for everybody involved in immigration just to stay on top of all this. Let's start with some questions. Teresa, you've served in the government at various times. How has the Trump administration been able to do so much in 1 year?
So thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you for eCornell for having me. I think we have to understand that this is a somewhat unique situation in that President Trump is serving a second term, but not consecutive to his first. And I think that's important. We understand how quickly he's been able to do things in this term, because a lot of him and his staff served in the first term, learned a lot about what it takes to actually move government, and spent those intervening 4 years planning exactly how to come in and very quickly change many, many parts of the immigration system. As you mentioned, a lot of it has been via executive orders. Trump has not really tried to push major immigration changes through legislation. Funding, yes. Immigration changes, no. Most of the changes have been administrative and have been through executive orders. One of the main ways he's doing this is by using expansive authorities that the president claims to have under national security, emergency powers. Many of his executive orders on immigration have claimed an emergency of some sort via crime or drugs, an invasion of immigration, and use that language to pull in authorities that traditionally have been more discretionary on the part of the executive branch and which courts have given the government more leeway on. Again, something I think they learned from the first administration is to try to use those authorities where they believe that the executive branch has the most authority to act. So if you look at a lot of the things he has done, whether it's in the executive orders themselves or the way he has talked about immigration, particularly enforcement, he's using that language of national security, terrorism, crime, invasion. He has invoked really old authorities such as the Alien Enemies Act to address immigration issues in this administration. So I think, again, that is a very different framework from we've seen immigration be addressed by presidents of either party for at least several decades. And I think that's really why he's been able to move things so quickly.
And that's been sort of the unofficial model of the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. You've heard about Let's Make America Great Again. USCIS says Let's Make America Safe Again. And that's sort of been the lens by which they've approached immigration. And Teresa, you talked about a whole of government approach where you've gotten out of the agency silos and basically all agencies are hands on deck in terms of enforcing immigration restrictions. Let's start talking about some of those specific restrictions. And Michelle, why don't you start us off with some of the humanitarian restrictions we saw in 2025?
Sure. Thank you, Steve, and thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I'll start with asylum. Asylum has pretty much been restricted for almost everybody in the United States. I'll start with the border. As Teresa said, one of the things the Trump administration did on day one was declare that immigration is an invasion, and that because of that, he is going to stopped access to asylum for everybody entering through U.S. borders, so upon entry. This is an expansion. We've had in the past restrictions on people on access to asylum from people entering between ports of entry, but now it's anybody, even if you're coming through a port of entry. And they actually terminated some of the pathways available to people to come in through ports of entry to seek asylum. So the CBP One app you may have heard about, which is a way that people used to be able to make an appointment and then proceed through requesting asylum once they entered. That is under litigation, and almost everything you hear me talk about today is being litigated. I should just say that. And even in cases where there are positive outcomes in terms of courts finding in favor of plaintiffs, they're almost always appealed and then continue to operate while those cases go through the courts. But the many restrictions on access to asylum at the border have been under litigation. We've had some positive outcomes, but again, they're under appeal. And so we're waiting to see how those play out. But in the meantime, people don't have access to asylum, but they do still have access to Convention Against Torture, CAT, and withholding of deportation claims. It's a higher hurdle. It's difficult. And again, there's restrictions and difficulties in people getting attorneys to help submit those requests, but that is still available. I would say, like so many of the things that are happening in immigration, it's a multi-layered approach or attack sort of on these accesses. So while people may still have some access to withholding, which prevents the United States from removing a person back to the country that they have established a fear from. But as you also may have heard a lot in the news, this administration has been looking at third country removals. And so even if you get some relief under Convention Against Torture or withholding, you are at great risk of still being detained and remaining in detention, and then also of being removed to another country that you may have no ties to and who may, again, many would say against international and U.S. law, being returned back to their country of origin after that. There's a lot more there, but that's the basics on the border. On the interior, there have also been restrictions on people's access to asylum. One being, again, something you may have heard about, which is people whose cases were dismissed when they go into court. A lot of those individuals were asylum seekers whose asylum cases were pending. They were being argued in front of a judge. In some cases, maybe even in the very last stages of that case going forward. And the administration started requesting that those cases be dismissed, which basically gets rid of and throws their entire case in the trash and starts them at zero. And then those folks were very often being detained and put into expedited removal immediately upon exiting the courtroom. And then we have restrictions on just how applications were being reviewed. I-589 is the name of the form that you fill out when you're applying for asylum. And one of the things this administration has done is become extremely nitpicky in how people fill out that form. It's already a very complex form, but now, for example, if you leave a question blank or put not applicable instead of answering the question with an explanation of why it's not applicable, just as an example, that case can be thrown out as an incomplete application. And then finally, because I don't want to go on too long here, there's a lot to cover, especially as of Thanksgiving weekend, when the National Guard was attacked by somebody who turned out to be an asylum grantee. All asylum applications have been paused and put on hold, so no decisions can be made on asylum, either negative or positive, until further notice. Sort of the process has continued in some cases, so interviews continue, but no decisions can be made. And in the case of people from 39 countries, there are also additional reviews. They can't get adjustment of status, so they can't get their green cards, their naturalization if they're about to become citizens. That has been frozen. And in addition, past asylum applications, so asylum applications admitted and approved under the Biden administration are all basically being reviewed and reconsidered, as well as all refugee arrivals. And I'll pause there to let you see where else we should go from here.
Yeah, there's a lot there. We didn't even discuss the refugee restrictions or terminating parole or terminating temporary protected status, but maybe we'll get to that a little bit later. Bita, let me turn it to you. There's been a vast increase in immigration enforcement operations in various cities. Why don't you tell us a little bit about those and what their effect has been?
Yeah, so again, expressing gratitude for the opportunity to be here and for folks who've joined. I think, as I think Teresa rightly pointed out, what we're seeing is almost like the term 2 of the Trump administration. And in the first term, there was an intentional effort to really hone in on jurisdictions that are so-called sanctuary jurisdictions as a way to sort of push back against restrictions on cooperation around immigration enforcement that local municipalities or states had decided under their power, under the 10th Amendment, to essentially determine, like, how do they use their public safety resources? What is the best interest of the municipality as it relates to cooperating with federal immigration and civil immigration enforcement efforts. And so many municipalities across the country had made intentional decisions around these questions, limiting cooperation in criminal investigations or criminal matters, in some cases participating in task forces around terrorism or other kind of trafficking or more serious criminal networks or conduct. But for civil immigration enforcement, making the decision that that was not the priority use of local resources, and in fact worked against the interests of local police departments and governments because it eroded trust in communities. And the reason that that's really important is because when you look at jurisdictions that made determinations like this, you're talking about places where, like New York City, nearly 40% of the population is foreign born. And on top of that, you have what's called mixed status families, right? Where there may be a US citizen, spouse or children, but there's one member of the household that doesn't have a durable status or maybe undocumented. That's 1 million people in a city like New York City. So it's really critical in the ability for local governance to advance their interests of public safety and health, to ensure that every resident feels comfortable interacting with local government, reporting crimes, seeking care at a public hospital, taking their children to school. So these have been sort of long-standing, really community debated policy interest advanced around trust with community members' decisions. And in the first Trump administration, they began to sort of weaponize this against almost exclusively Democratic leaders across the country. And there was litigation, particularly around the conditioning of funds to municipalities to essentially say that if you don't cooperate with federal immigration enforcement goals, that we would restrict grant making. That litigation ultimately didn't advance to the Supreme Court. The municipalities and states were successful in the appellate court level largely. And then, of course, the administration changed. So like Teresa noted, sort of out the gate in 2025, we see this just dramatic escalation of enforcement in some of these jurisdictions, starting with Los Angeles. Then we see Chicago, a large-scale escalation, Portland, North Carolina, and ultimately now in Minnesota, in Minneapolis. And certainly that's not exclusive. We're seeing increased kind of raids and enforcement across the country, not limited to those jurisdictions. But what we do see in those places is this attempt, sort of using some of the language that they've really weaponized against the municipalities, or in the interest of sort of advancing their authorities, and saying that there's public safety concerns and that there is a need for federal intervention to address those public safety concerns. That's really sort of the rhetoric that they've encapsulated, or just tried to justify the kind of increased enforcement actions that they have deployed in LA and Chicago and elsewhere. And with that has been the intention to essentially federalize National Guard, such that there is under federal control a militarized force that's essentially assisting in the operations, right? And ensuring sort of the safety of federal officers, they say, right? And making sure that there's not unrest as some of the enforcement actions are undertaken. And I think critically what I want to point out is in all of these areas, you've just seen an incredible response from community members, who many of whom kind of have understood through some of the logic that the goal was maybe to go after public safety risks. The goals were maybe to advance enforcement efforts, or kind of high enforcement efforts against people who had severe criminal histories. But really what people are saying is that it's quite overbroad, the enforcement. It's really a sort of anybody kind of collaterally stopped is being kind of swept up in the enforcement efforts. And I speak with my hands, apologize, and my computer keeps raising my hand while I'm doing it. So I'm going to try to sit on my hands. But we're seeing, certainly at the start in LA, an effort that really was people being profiled because of the color of their skin, because of their ability to speak English without an accent, because of where they were working, maybe like day laborers outside of Home Depot. And so, and we've seen sort of supercharged kind of confrontations between people who are really trying to observe what's happening, bear witness to what's happening, make sure there's accountability and recording and evidence around what is happening to support community members and enforcement agents, federal enforcement agents that are seeking to advance some of these goals. So in brief, I want to say a couple of things. On the National Guard question, this made its sort of way through litigation, and ultimately this Supreme Court ruled in a case that Illinois brought that at least they were going to sustain the lower court's decisions to prevent the federalization of the National Guard. So what does that mean? It means that the federal government hadn't substantiated or shown the extreme sort of facts that are necessary to sort of justify that kind of move, and in fact hadn't shown that they couldn't do what they needed to do using their regular forces, which is this language in the law, without federalizing the National Guard. And so the Trump administration essentially recently said it's going to stop its effort to deploy the Guard to Illinois, to California, and to Portland, Oregon, the 3 jurisdictions it had attempted to do so. And there remains a question as to whether or not they'll advance this goal using another statute, the Insurrection Act. And so I think that's what sort of folks are waiting to see. And that, I think, gets us to really the human consequence of what all of this has meant. It's meant a dramatic increase in the number of people arrested, a dramatic amount of fear in communities about individuals who are citizens feeling like because of the color of their skin or where they work or who their family members are, they have to carry their passports around, or they're concerned leaving their homes. It has meant parents being afraid to take their children to school. And it has really tragically meant things like what we witnessed yesterday, which is a US citizen, Renee Good, being murdered at the hands of federal agents. And this is just, I think for many local leaders, it has been something that they've vocalized a fear around what's going to happen. This happened in Chicago as well, that the kinds of actions and the aggressive nature of the enforcement and the lack and the degree to which it's overbroad means that you're going to see escalation, you're going to see unnecessary and tragic impacts and harms to community members, and has raised a lot of questions for local jurisdictions, whether it's a city, a county, or a state, about what their authorities are and the powers they have to continue to advance their priorities around public health and safety in the face of this just incredibly aggressive federal immigration enforcement effort.
Great. So Dan, let's turn to you. What restrictions have you seen in the work visa and employment-based visa area in 2025?
Well, thanks, Steve, and thanks to Cornell for hosting this. Quite a few. It really has been a lot. And I was thinking earlier as a native of Buffalo that Grover Cleveland was the last president who didn't have consecutive terms, but definitely didn't spend the 4 years in the wilderness preparing as well as they did here. And Project 2025 really was the blueprint for this. And I feel as if during the first Trump administration, we sort of talked in some ways about taking everything we heard seriously, but not literally. Now we really are taking everything literally as we move forward. With that said, one of the messages that I took from Project 2025 is that student visas and H-1B work visas in particular are pipelines for international individuals to come to the U.S. and compete with U.S. workers. So we've seen significant restrictions on both of those, and I'll talk about that in a minute. In terms of student visas, we saw earlier in the year large-scale terminations of large-scale revocations. Not huge numbers. There are over 1 million foreign students in the U.S., but this was about 3,000. But it was growing exponentially. There were a few the first week, maybe hundreds the second week, thousands the third week. That was stopped by a court case, but it has had a chilling effect. And I think we're seeing a combination of that and the fourth bullet point, which is visa and adjudication delays, just a real challenge. Some schools are seeing up to a 70% drop in the number of students who are actually getting their visas on time to come here. In terms of the H-1B, for those of you who, we talked in beforehand about making sure we define terms for those who may have heard of the H-1B but are not quite sure what it is. It's probably the most common professional working visa that is used in a wide variety of situations and has been for decades. The president, by proclamation last year, added a $100,000 fee toward that would be for the H-1B. And the proclamation was not terribly clearly written and was interpreted in a variety of different ways over the course of a weekend and then several weeks by different government agencies, sometimes in different ways. Again, this can have a chilling effect as employers and individuals want to find a way, want to plan out their lives and know what, if an employer is doing hiring, they want to know, is there a $100,000 fee or not? At the moment, the H-1B $100,000 fee is focused on people who are coming from abroad. So if somebody's already in the US and they're granted a change of status or an extension of H-1B status, the $100,000 fee does not apply. But if, let's say, a university is hiring a mathematics professor from Bulgaria directly on an H-1B for a tenure track position, the $100,000 fee would apply. As others have said, litigation is common, and we all follow various litigation trackers. Everything is being fought out in the courts. There are 3 lawsuits going on. One of them, the district court judge a couple weeks ago said that the $100,000 fee could continue, but that is being appealed. And also the opinion had some thoughts on ways and on new arguments that could be made. There are 2 other lawsuits that are going on, so we will see what happens with that. Last and quickly is the social media vetting. I think this really goes to some of the due process points that Vito was making, and Michelle, I believe. Right now, in order to get a visa abroad, and a visa is a very specific term for the entry document that somebody uses to come to the U.S. in temporary status, tourist, student, H-1B worker, et cetera. There is now widespread social media vetting at consulates. We don't know exactly what that means. We do know that individuals are required to make their social media profiles public. I have a lot of concerns about privacy there, but that is the requirement. And my guess is that they don't really have time to do a deep dive on everybody, but they are not only probably looking at issues of people's political speech, of what they're saying, but also it is another way that the government can and may look for inconsistencies. In general, government officials look for inconsistencies when they're adjudicating a petition. So if somebody's social media indicates that a person might have been working in the US while they were on a student visa or a tourist visa, that could lead to issues. I realized myself that my LinkedIn profile had the wrong date that I started my first job. That those could be those could be natural mistakes, but those mistakes, especially with AI tools and a lot of money from the big beautiful bill for more AI screening, could find those kind of things. I did also just want to mention quickly, if you're looking to Google something, the AAUP versus Rubio case, American Association of University Professors, was a free speech case, and there are more coming. Steve?
So all of this is causing delays in adjudications, both overseas at consulates and also at USCIS. And we've noted that, or I've read at least, that both USCIS staff and State Department staff are shrinking. So basically all of these remaining staff are asked to do more with less staff. Teresa, what other major immigration restrictions have occurred in 2025?
Well, we've touched on an awful lot of them. I think we also need to recognize some of the changes that seem minor, for example, social media vetting, are just adding time to the regular process. We saw this under the first Trump administration. They talked about extreme vetting for cases at USCIS. And as you mentioned, or somebody mentioned, that the new motto at USCIS is "Make America Safe Again." they are investing very heavily in ensuring that whatever they do, that the people they are admitting are not, the term is not anti-American. And I think this sort of ideological vetting, we've had some of this in our laws for a long time. For example, communism and anarchy could be reasons for denial of some sort of visa status, but this is beyond that. And so when you talk about like the social media vetting, what are they looking for? Well, one of the things explicitly they're supposed to be looking for is whether or not somebody has espoused anti-American views. And this obviously gets to First Amendment protections, particularly for people already in the United States, but they don't necessarily apply in visa application situations where somebody is outside the United States and looking to come in. I think you did note some of the changes to the work visas. I will note that the business community is very concerned about this, so much so that they have been making overtures to the administration, maybe not publicly, maybe not vocally, but they've had some impact. So for example, farmers who saw very difficult times getting H-2A visa workers in were successful in convincing the administration to prioritize and facilitate those visas for the upcoming seasons. So the U.S. Department of Agriculture created an office to help streamline the application process for farmers. They have not had that before. So there are some small ways where the administration is recognizing the impact to employers of some of these things that they have already done. But I think we're also going to see more things coming up. We're just now starting to see regulatory change. I mentioned that a lot of this was done by executive order early in the administration. Regulations take a lot longer to write and develop, but we're starting to see a regular cadence of regulations coming out of the government now. And regulations are a way of ensuring that changes that administration makes to policy can continue into another administration. Another administration can change the regulations, but there's a longer process to do so. They can't do it very quickly by executive order necessarily. And so we're going to see more of that. Most recently, we saw, for example, and I'm sure others will talk about it, a new iteration of the public charge rule. We have seen a new regulation to change how H-1B visas are processed, the lottery process for H-1B visas. I think we're going to see more of that coming in the next year as the agencies get up to speed with their regulation and rulemaking processes.
And that's a great segue into talking about what further restrictions we might see in 2026. And Bita, Teresa mentioned the public charge rule that is probably coming down the pike. But what other changes do you foresee in your area?
Yeah, I'd love to pull back on that in just a minute, and I'm not sure how much the audience understands about public charge, so I'll speak to that for just a second because I'm not sure any of us really understand it. And again, sort of honing in on why this matters in communities, right? For states, for localities. You've heard us talk about sort of this sort of attempt to do a whole of government response, right? To eliminate silos between agencies in the goal of sort of advancing immigration enforcement efforts. And that includes, I think you've heard us touch on really kind of like a dismantling of the legal immigration system, taking people who have been in legal status and making them have no legal status, whether that's like a temporary protected status individual, somebody who entered with parole, or making the sort of entire process of sort of realizing whether it's your permanent residence or citizenship much more difficult, right? And creating risk environments around all of that. So enforcement actions at U.S. citizenship offices, which is something that almost never occurred, right? Cases getting dismissed at the court, people who have long-standing, maybe over a decade, checking in with ICE and have been in good status doing that and accountable and holding their work authorization and paying their taxes, all of a sudden having that removed. I think the sort of egregiousness of the dismantling of like the legal immigration system or people who are trying to comply is tremendous, and we haven't even scratched the surface of that. And I think in addition to that is this goal around essentially making life difficult, right? and in some instances cruelly. And that has to do with some of this elimination of silos and some of what we see in terms of public charge, which is a goal around really eliminating the ability for people to seek support, whether that's through local benefits that they may receive, like food assistance or other things, whether that's through the public health systems or the access to Medicaid or other things, creating an atmosphere where immigrants, even if they're perfectly legally eligible for these things, are so afraid to access them that there's a chilling effect and people withdraw and sort of pull themselves into the shadows. And this is so pervasive. There's just massive amounts of data sharing that's happening between the Department of Homeland Security and other parts of the administration, like HHS that administers Medicaid or other kind of benefits like SNAP and others. There's instruction to make sure that there's auditing of people who are seeking these benefits. And in the interpretation or sort of the proposed public charge rule, it's not yet in effect at this moment, but they've essentially sought to rescind what has kind of been known as the interpretation of what might make somebody a public charge who's seeking to become a legal permanent resident or come to the United States, which has, been largely understood as being primarily reliant on the government. They've now proposed rescission of a rule that the Biden administration had advanced through regulation to codify that interpretation, and instead to say that the larger goal would be if somebody can be self-sufficient, and the nature in which they would make that determination is quite broad. It's essentially it would grant discretion to an officer to look at everything from your education to your health, to the likelihood that you might be unhealthy. Like all of a sudden officers are medical professionals. It's unclear how. And what that training might be. But essentially, again, I think I want to emphasize that this is sort of an emphasis of making people withdraw from utilization of public services in a way that could be quite detrimental to communities. If children are not getting the medical care that they need, if families aren't accessing services that they may be perfectly entitled to and eligible for, because of this overarching fear. And there's an acknowledgement in the regulation that the notice of rulemaking that the Immigration Service released, that they expect that to happen, that they expect there to be a chilling effect. And when this was first proposed in the first Trump administration, municipalities ran data that showed that there was already a chilling effect before it ever went into effect, tremendously. People just were perfectly legal permanent residents who were eligible to access benefits choosing not to because they didn't know what the impact may be and were afraid to do so. And I just want to end lastly in saying it's so important to think critically about what's happening. We're seeing this exact discourse get weaponized in Minnesota right now around the investigation of fraud in COVID funding for childcare utilization, and being talked about as though this is something that only this party, the Republican Party or the Trump administration, cares about, when in fact the investigation in Minnesota began well before the Trump administration came into office, and actually folks were prosecuted in 2022 around this investigation. All of our leaders should care about fraud, right? And all of our leaders should seek to make sure that there's trust in the public in how their money is being spent and utilized. But you have to do so in a manner that continues to build that trust instead of erode really the population in believing that government can deliver services and that people who need them can access them. So we're really in dangerous, I think, territory around some of this. And it's so important for all of us to think critically about what is being said to us and how we support our neighbors in a moment where they might be afraid to access the food benefits that they need.
And Michelle, what do you see on the horizon in 2026 in terms of increased detentions and immigration enforcement?
Yeah, I mean, more of the same. I think the administration has been very bold, but they'll continue to be bold because it's worked for them so far. Some of the things I didn't get to, refugee numbers, for example, are already slated to be significantly down from previous years. So we were up in the over 120,000 refugees being resettled a year. For 2026, the goal is to 7,500. Practically nothing relative to the need that there is. And the majority of those have already been announced that they will go towards white Afrikaners from South Africa. So large departure from the past. We see TPS, temporary protective status, which is a temporary status given to people who can't go back safely to their country. That is being terminated in many cases. That is somewhat routine that those renewals come up. But what we've seen this administration doing, and what I anticipate will really come to fruition in 2026, is that they're not only terminating temporary protective status for many nationalities where there is an urgent need for it still, where there still is a lot of risk for people to go back to those countries, but also doing so sort of retroactively, undoing Biden administration extensions of temporary protective status. And then, all of those folks are again become more vulnerable to detention. We've seen detention increase drastically already. So we are now detaining over 69,000 people on any given day. That is up from what was around 40,000 at the beginning of 2025. And the administration is now seeking an additional $4.2 billion to detain people just for detention, on top of a $40 billion increase they already received with the big, beautiful bill. So that's actually something that's happening right now. It's being discussed in Congress as part of the new appropriations. So another opportunity for people to take action would be to say something to their elected officials about what they think about an additional $4.2 billion going to detain people. And we'll just say that this is on top of a situation in which they've eliminated most of the oversight of immigration detention, and we've seen a drastic increase in deaths in custody. 32 people died in immigration detention custody in 2025. That is more than double what we had the previous year. And I would predict 5 of those deaths occurred in December. I think that those numbers, unfortunately, unless something changes, will go up drastically, and we'll see even more people dying in U.S. immigration custody in 2026. So, yeah, sort of grim, but there are things people can do to push back.
Well, that's a good segue. Let's talk about what Cornell Law is doing to try to help immigrants. Dan, let's start with you. You are deeply involved in our Path to Papers project at Cornell Law School. Why don't you tell us what that is and what it's accomplished so far?
Sure. Thanks, Steve. So a couple of years ago, thanks in large part to Steve's efforts, we were able to secure a grant to begin a project that is basically a nonprofit immigration clinic, but focused on employer-sponsored options. Immigration, as you may know, is a game of categories. With each person, we try to look at family, humanitarian, and employment-based options and see what might work. Sometimes one thing may work for one person and one may not for another. And a lot of these individual categories were created at different times and sometimes not harmonized. So what we've seen over the years is that people with fragile immigration situations, such as DACA recipients, such as the TPS that you were just hearing about, or the hundreds of thousands of parolees who were allowed in during the Biden administration and earlier from Afghanistan and Venezuela and so forth, the Ukraine, people with long pending asylum cases who may be in a vulnerable situation now. All of those folks really should be screened for all categories, family, humanitarian, and employment-based. What we saw was a disconnect where a lot of wonderful nonprofits that were supporting these populations really didn't know very much about employer sponsorship. A lot of these folks have work cards that are working and may have employers who'd be interested in filing a petition to keep them. On the other hand, we saw employment-based lawyers like me who didn't always know what to do with somebody who had a very complicated immigration situation. So Path to Papers now has 8 attorneys. I'm really thrilled, part-time and full-time. That's tremendous. We've done over 1,000 consultations in the last year and a half. We're focused initially on the Bay Area of California, and we're trying to see what we can learn. We've developed our website, path2papers.org, has resources for employers. We have resources for individuals, and we also provide technical assistance for attorneys who are trying to pursue some of these pathways. And we're hoping that this can be a way to move people forward. DACA, in my mind, is an amazing program. I remember the days before we had it, when Dreamers were not able to work, but it was never intended to be permanent. And so, regardless of what happens with the DACA court decision, we do want to keep moving people who have vulnerable, fragile immigration situations into longer-term status.
And there's a lot more that the law school is doing. You can see that on the slide there. But in the interest of time, let's try to end on a more optimistic point. What can people do, both locally and nationally, to help immigrants? Michelle, let's start with you.
Sure. I mean, I think be informed, learn about what's really happening. You're going to hear this from all of us. I think there's a lot of misinformation out there. Immigration in particular is very politicized, so people skew how they talk about it. Look for trusted sources and learn what's really happening. I think advocacy with your elected officials. I mean, I'll leave it to Bida to give more detail on how you can involve locally, but I think local and state level activities are going to be critical in this process to help turn things around. But your elected members of Congress also should be saying a lot about this. And as I just mentioned, the immigration detention additional funding that I would, people can raise their opinion on that and let their elected officials know. And support litigation. Litigation has been critical this past year and is going to continue to be so. A lot of these cases are going to drag on, and the folks doing these class action litigations and even litigation on behalf of individuals is going to be critical. And I'll let some of my colleagues say more about the areas they work in.
Teresa, Michelle mentioned, that there's been appropriations that would help increase immigration enforcement. What can I or you do on the legislative side to try to advance immigrants' rights?
So there's a tried and true saying in Washington, D.C. that if left to their own devices, Congress will do nothing. So they are more than happy to never vote on immigration if they don't have to. It's up to people to talk to their members of Congress. I will echo what Michelle said. Not just understand what's going on right now, but try to understand more about the immigration system generally. If you want to understand why and how a DACA person can't easily transfer to an immigration visa status that would allow them to keep working, you need to understand how the system works. It's very complicated. I'm not going to say it's not, but get a basic understanding, and that will help insulate you against some of the shorthand that is the way immigration is talked about by our elected leaders, by people in the press, and by talking heads like us, right? On the news channels. You need to have a basic understanding so you understand, for example, why can't people just get in line? There's a really complicated answer to that, but it's the case. So I would say try to learn what you can, and then talk to your members of Congress, but don't just say, do something. What you will hear from a lot of them is, well, I've introduced X bill and I've tried to vote for both bill, and this other part, the other party, the people in charge won't let us. What have you done to work with them, right? What have you done to try to advance this? Don't blame the other side for stopping you. We elected you to try to get legislation done. So this year, 2026 is an election year. Every member of the House of Representatives is going to come back begging for your vote to be reelected. And instead of letting them say all the things they would do if you reelected them, why haven't they done it so far? And what have they done to try to get it done? It's very easy to believe that people aren't talking to each other. I will tell you right now, today, there are bipartisan groups in Congress actively looking to try to do something on immigration. But I will also tell you that they face a very big uphill battle, in part because there's not a lot of people supporting those kind of efforts. So really, it's important to let your members of Congress know that you want them to try to work across the aisle, that you want them to try to come to agreement, that getting something done is better than coming back to us and saying, we got nothing done, but elect me again. I would say that that shouldn't be a way to get your vote. But those are some of the most important things. We have seen, and Bita mentioned, there are lots of things going on at the local level. Local members of your state legislature are engaging in immigration debates right now. County councils are involved in immigration right now. City mayors are involved in immigration right now. Talk to them about what you want to see. But also recognize at the end of the day, immigration is a federal law issue. And there's not a lot that states and localities can do. They cannot provide you legal status. That has to come from Congress. So no matter what policies they may have in place that can support immigrants locally, at the end of the day, Congress has to change the laws. And so I would argue that definitely talk to your members of Congress and urge them to do something.
And to me, this is somewhat like the civil rights movement or the environmental movement. It had to be grassroots sort of advocating and pressuring Congress before Congress finally made some changes. And I think we need to do that on immigration as well. And Bita, why don't you tell us what people can do at the state and local level to advance immigrants' rights?
Yeah, so I want to echo a lot of what's been said, but I want to emphasize a couple of points. One is that, and honestly, I'm just pulling from what I'm seeing across the country as people really leading. I want to say that very clearly. It's been incredible to see people really understand what this moment has called for in terms of using their privilege, whether they're, a US citizen or otherwise, using their voices, understanding that democracy requires that we exercise our rights within it. That the principles that we hold dear, like due process or people having their fair day in court, require us to make sure that those systems exist, right? And that they can be accessed and utilized and they're not dismantled. And I think we're seeing that play out across this country in just really inspiring ways. So the first thing I would say is know what your rights are, right? Know what you can do. And that includes your First Amendment right. That includes the really, really important thing that so many have been doing, which is witnessing, documenting, supporting their neighbors, their loved ones, who may be experiencing raids, who there may be a child who's left behind and a family who needs sort of support wrapped around it. There may be somebody who's navigating a court system alone and doesn't know exactly what kinds of support or relief they may need to seek. And so in your community, you can try to find know your rights information. There are many municipalities that have created these. LA County has, Chicago has, as well as New York and others, but so have the ACLU and large sort of civil rights or civic or immigration rights organizations in your community. So find a trusted source that you trust and that you know is producing good information, and learn what your rights are, and then teach your neighbors those rights and support community members around those rights. Join maybe projects where people are accompanying people to court or to an appointment who may be unrepresented. Engage your local leaders to talk about the import of supporting legal services, because it actually does make a difference in somebody's ability to stay and fight their case and not be detained or summarily deported without the ability to exercise a benefit that they might be eligible for. Make sure that everybody can receive services or the needs that they need in a moment where they feel under attack. There's a lot that you can do. You should find the space where you're comfortable and where you have community and build around that, but make sure you're exercising your right. And the last thing I'll say is, my family is from Iran, and my parents came here shortly after the Iranian Revolution. And the thing that was instilled in me from a young age and continuously through my adulthood is that you have to fight for democracy. You have to fight for the rights that you have continuously. It's an active project. And so many things that we have, we maybe take for granted or we think will remain there for us. But the truth is, and we've seen this across the world in so many different instances, when we don't exercise those rights, when we're afraid to speak up for them, when we know the consequence can be so severe, like we saw yesterday, a mother, a US citizen in Minneapolis get shot, when we know that that may be a consequence, we get afraid. But it's so important to see that hundreds of thousands, millions of people across this country are feeling that same urgency to question what's happening and to protect our communities and protect our rights and to make sure that we live in a system and in a country that we value and that shares our values.
Well, that's a great way. And we're running out of time. I think we have time just for one question. And Dan, I'll pose it to you. One of our audience members asked about duration of status and possible limitations on that. Why don't you explain for the audience what duration of status is and what might happen in 2026 in that regard?
Sure. And this is one of those things that's really in the weeds, but does make a big difference. So at the moment, and for decades, people who come here on student visas, on training or exchange visas called J visas, such as medical residents and fellows, or journalists, come here and they don't have a fixed expiration date. Like usually if you come here as a tourist, there's an expiration date and you're supposed to leave in a month or 6 months. These folks don't have a fixed expiration date when they come in. And the idea is that it's not always clear how long something might take. My wife is a college professor. Some students need a little longer or a little shorter to finish a program. With this new duration, there's a proposed regulation on duration of status, which would add on a fixed end date. And then after that, individuals would have to file an application and have it approved and have an immigration officer approve their extension of stay. On the surface, that doesn't sound crazy. I mean, it seems, well, why not check in with people? However, this is a huge issue because what it means is that now an immigration officer, rather than let's say somebody's academic advisor, will be deciding whether they need more time to finish their degree, whether they can change majors, whether they can move to another program. And also, as we've discussed earlier, the Immigration Service has lost 20% of its staff, and this could get worse. So the idea of adding millions of additional applications that need to be filed and approved before people can change their, extend their program or work is a huge issue. So the final regulation will be issued at some point, and if there's anything I can guarantee, it's that there will be litigation.
Great. Well, I wish we had more time. We could easily spend another hour discussing some of these changes and how you can help fight them. But we have to end. I want to thank you for participating, to the panelists, and thank you for the excellent questions from the audience. I wish we had time to answer all of them. If you want more information about what Cornell Law is doing on immigration, you can click on the URL on the slide there. And if you feel so inclined to donate to help Cornell do even more on immigration, you can use the QR code there. With that, I'll end today's webinar, and let's all hope that 2026 is better than 2025 on immigration. Thank you.